The sound that woke me wasn't his voice. It was the scrape of a chair. Wood against tile. Low. Deliberate. I was already sitting at the head of the table, smoothing the lace cloth with trembling fingers, pretending my hands didn't hurt, pretending my lip didn't throb, pretending my ribs didn't scream every time I breathed too deeply. I had been awake all night. He didn't know that yet. When he walked into the kitchen, he moved like a man who believed the world owed him space. Like nothing in this house could exist without his permission. He didn't look at me at first. Didn't notice the swelling on my face. Didn't notice the stillness. He went straight for the biscuits. Picked one up. Took a bite. Crumbs fell onto the floor. And then he started talking. About how things were going to change. About how I needed to remember my place. About how the house was his now, whether I liked it or not. I watched his mouth move. Listened to the confidence in his voice. And waited. Because the moment he noticed the chair beside me move, just slightly, his entire body froze. Color drained from his face so fast it looked like someone had pulled the plug on him. The biscuit slipped from his fingers. Hit the plate. Rolled. Crumbled. In that single second, he understood something he had never considered before. My silence the night before hadn't been fear. Had been a verdict. But to understand how we arrived at that table, at that moment where breakfast felt more like a courtroom, you need to know who I am. My name is Eleanor Whitfield. I'm 69 years old. Widow. And until very recently, I believed I was a mother who had failed quietly. I live in a neighborhood where the houses lean toward each other like old friends. Big porches. Slow mornings. Oak trees that have seen more history than most people alive. I raised my son here alone after my husband died. Worked 2 jobs. Skipped meals so he wouldn't have to. Learned how to be strong without ever calling it that. And for most of my life strength worked. Until it didn't. It was a little after 3 in the morning when he came home. I was in the kitchen, rocking slowly in my chair, listening to an old hymn on the radio. Low enough not to wake the house, loud enough to keep my thoughts from spiraling. Rain was pounding against the windows, hard and angry, but that wasn't what startled me. It was the way the key scraped against the door. Rough, impatient, violent. He stumbled inside smelling like cheap liquor and cigarettes, water dripping from his coat onto the floor I had mopped earlier that day. I stayed quiet. Silence had become survival. Keys flew from his hand. Something shattered. I knew the sound instantly. My grandmother's blue vase. He didn't look back. He came into the kitchen and when he saw me, something dark flickered behind his eyes, like my presence itself offended him. He started yelling. About his life. About his failures. About how everything wrong with him somehow traced back to me. I stood up slowly. Go to bed, I said. You're not well. That was it. That sentence was the match. He grabbed my arms. Shook me so hard my teeth rattled. Threw me backward into the cabinet. The world exploded into glass and pain. And when his hand came across my face, loud, sharp, final, I tasted blood and understood something terrifying. This wasn't an argument. This was violence. I didn't scream. I didn't cry. I stayed there on the floor, looking at the man who used to be my son as he turned away and left me bleeding in the kitchen. That night I didn't decide to fight back. I decided to end something. And by morning, he was going to learn that love doesn't mean immunity. Means accountability. And what came next would change everything. I didn't move for a long time after he went upstairs. The silence he left behind wasn't peaceful. It was heavy. The kind of quiet that presses against your chest until breathing feels like work. Rain kept falling outside, steady and merciless, but inside the house everything felt suspended. Like the moment after something shatters, when you're waiting for the last piece to hit the floor. I lay there on the kitchen tiles, curled inward, holding myself the way I used to hold him when he was small and scared of thunderstorms. My back throbbed. My face burned. Blood clung sticky and metallic at the corner of my mouth. I remember thinking very clearly, this is how women disappear. Not all at once. Not dramatically. Just quietly. in pieces. I pushed myself up using the cabinet he'd thrown me into. The wood was solid, unmoved. That steadiness mattered more than I can explain. I shuffled to the half-bath and flicked on the light. The mirror didn't flinch. Showed me everything. The swelling. The bruise blooming dark and angry beneath my eye. The split lip. The woman staring back at me looked smaller than I remembered. Older. Tired in a way sleep doesn't fix. For a moment grief flooded me. Not just for myself but for the boy I raised. The one who used to run to the door when I came home, arms wide, shouting my name like I was something holy. Where did he go? Then something shifted. It wasn't rage. It wasn't panic. It was clarity. Cold. Dark. Focused. I turned on the tap and splashed water on my face. Stung. But pain that reminded me I was still here. Still breathing. Still capable of choosing what happened next. I didn't go to bed. Instead I went back to the kitchen. The clock on the stove read 3:47 a.m. I tied on my apron with hands that no longer shook. Cooking has always been how I think. How I survive. When my husband died I cooked. When bills piled up I cooked. When loneliness crept in I cooked. So I cooked now. Flour. Butter. Baking powder. Muscle memory took over. Dough came together beneath my palms, warm and forgiving. I slid the first tray into the oven and sat down at the table while it baked. That's when I noticed the digital photo frame. It sat quietly on the counter, cycling through memories like nothing had changed. There he was at 8 years old, holding up a fish too small to matter but proud like he'd conquered the world. His father behind him laughing. Alive. Whole. My throat tightened. The frame changed again. Graduation. Cap and gown. My arm around him. My smile so wide it hurt. The church cheering. People calling him a good man. And suddenly I understood something that nearly broke me. I hadn't lost my son overnight. I'd been losing him slowly, while I kept forgiving things that should have never been forgiven. The oven timer went off. I stood up, wiped my hands and pulled out the tray. Golden. Perfect. I set it down carefully. And that's when the plan began to form. Not revenge. Not rage. Justice. I wasn't going to scream at him. I wasn't going to beg. I wasn't going to hide or leave or pretend anymore. I was going to make him face what he'd done. In daylight, in silence, in front of witnesses who couldn't be ignored. The clock ticked forward. 4:30 a.m. I poured myself coffee. Strong. Black. Bitter. Stairs, he snored. Unaware. Unprepared. I baked another batch. And another. By the time the sky outside began to pale from black to bruised gray, I had already decided something irreversible. By breakfast, he would no longer be the man in control. And he had no idea who I had already called. Not yet. I almost hid the bruise. My hand hovered over the makeup drawer, fingers brushing the smooth gold tube of concealer I'd bought months earlier, just in case. That's what I told myself back then. Just in case I needed to look presentable while breaking inside. I stared at it for a long moment. Then I shoved the drawer closed. No, not today. If truth was going to save me, it needed to be seen. The house was still dark, the kind of quiet that only exists before dawn. I moved through it slowly, deliberately, every step grounded, every decision intentional. Upstairs, he slept like nothing in the world had changed. Like he hadn't fractured something sacred hours earlier. I brewed more coffee. The smell filled the kitchen. Rich, grounding, familiar. Once, I used to wake him with that smell, believing maybe if his mornings were gentle enough, his days would be kinder. How foolish that feels now. I set the table with care. Not nervously. Not frantically. Only. White lace tablecloth. My wedding china. Polished silver. The table looked like forgiveness. It wasn't. It was evidence. I glanced at the clock. 6:12 a.m. Picked up the phone. The first number I dialed belonged to Margaret Hale, my neighbor of 40 years. Retired judge. Sharp as a blade. The kind of woman who walks into a room and makes liars swallow their words. She answered on the second ring. Eleanor. Her voice snapped awake instantly. What happened? That's when I knew she already suspected. He hurt me, I said. Silence. Then. I'm coming over. No, I replied. Not yet. 8 o'clock. Breakfast. Another pause. Longer this time. I understand, she said finally. And Eleanor, I'm proud of you. When I hung up, my knees trembled. Not from fear but relief. I wasn't alone anymore. The second call was harder. Police. I asked for Detective Samuel Reed. He'd watched my son grow up. Sung hymns beside him in church. Called him a good kid. His voice was thick with sleep when he answered. She assaulted me, I said. No hesitation. No apology. The air changed instantly. Where is he now? Asleep. I want it handled quietly. With dignity. There was a long exhale on the other end. I'll be there at 8, he said. With backup. The third call nearly broke me. My sister. She didn't ask questions. She just listened while I told her everything I'd never said out loud. When I finished, she whispered, You did the right thing. I set the phone down and stared at the wall until my breathing steadied. 3 calls. 3 pillars. Law. Authority. Witness. I went upstairs then. Showered. Let the hot water sting my back. Dressed in navy blue. The color of funerals and truth. Pulled my hair tight. Stood tall despite the ache. When I looked in the mirror, I didn't see a victim. I saw a woman who had crossed a line she could never uncross. At 7:58 a.m., I sat down at the head of the table, smoothed the lace, folded my hands, and waited. Upstairs, a door creaked. A step. He was waking up. And in exactly 2 minutes, everything he believed about power was about to collapse. The first thing he did was kick the broken vase. Ceramic scraped against tile. Shards pushed aside like they were nothing. Like history was disposable. Like my grandmother's hands hadn't once held that same blue curve while telling me stories about survival. I heard it from the dining room. I said nothing. Then he appeared in the doorway. Hair damp from a rushed shower. Shirt wrinkled. Eyes swollen with sleep and leftover arrogance. He paused when he saw the table. Really saw it. The lace, the china, the steam rising from the coffee. Confusion crossed his face. Then relief. Then something worse. Satisfaction. He smiled. Crooked. Certain. Well, he said, stepping into the room, stretching like a man who'd slept well. Look at this. He pulled out the chair at the far end and dropped into it like a king returning to his throne. I was wondering how long it'd take, he continued, grabbing a biscuit without asking. Guess you finally understood. Crumbs scattered across the cloth. He chewed loudly. I watched. He gestured around the table with the biscuit. See, this is how things work. You don't push me. You don't lecture me. And everything stays peaceful. He reached for the coffee pot. I don't want sugar today, he added like he was ordering at a diner. Still I said nothing. That unsettled him slightly. I saw it, the flicker behind his eyes, but he dismissed it quickly. In his mind, silence meant surrender. It always had. He finally looked at my face. Really looked. His eyes lingered on my lip. On the bruise. For a second, just one, I thought I saw something like guilt. Then it vanished. Damn, he muttered. You bruise easy these days. That was the moment something inside me went completely still. Not numb. Resolved. I folded my napkin slowly. Placed it beside my plate. At exactly 8 o'clock the doorbell rang. Sharp. Clear. Precise. His head snapped up. What the hell? He said, irritation flashing. Did you invite someone? Yes, I replied. It was the first word I'd spoken that morning. My voice didn't shake. His smile faltered. I don't want company, he snapped. Send them away. Understood. Every joint protested, but I didn't show it. He watched me walk past him, irritation hardening into anger. Didn't you hear me? I didn't turn around. The doorbell rang again. I opened the front door and stepped back. Margaret Hale stood on my porch in a pressed linen suit, posture flawless, eyes immediately locking onto my face. Her jaw tightened just slightly, but she said nothing. Behind her stood Detective Samuel Reed. Uniform crisp, expression unreadable. 2 officers flanked him, quiet and immovable. Authority filled the doorway. Smiled. "Good morning," I said. "Please come in. Breakfast is ready." They stepped inside. Behind me, I heard the scrape of a chair. Sharp inhale. The sound of a plate rattling. When I turned back toward the dining room, my son was standing now, frozen, his face drained of color. His eyes darted from Margaret to the officers to me. The biscuit slipped from his fingers, hit the floor, broke apart. "Mom," he whispered. Margaret walked past him without a glance and took the seat beside mine. Detective Reed remained standing. The room fell silent except for the clock ticking in the next room. Each second sounded louder than the last. I met my son's eyes. And for the first time in years he looked afraid. Because he finally understood. This wasn't breakfast. This was judgment. And the evidence was sitting right across from him. The most terrifying thing in that room wasn't the police uniforms. It was the way no one rushed to speak. Margaret sat down slowly, smoothing her jacket like she had all the time in the world. Detective Reed stayed standing, hands folded in front of him, posture neutral but unyielding. The 2 officers behind him might as well have been stone. My son remained frozen. You could almost hear his mind scrambling, searching for a version of reality where this was a misunderstanding, a prank, something he could still dominate with volume or charm. "Mom," he said again, louder this time. "What's going on?" I didn't answer. Margaret did. "Sit," Detective Reed said. 2 words. Flat. Final. Daniel hesitated. Pride fought fear on his face. Fear won. He pulled the chair back and sat down slowly, like the air itself had weight. Margaret picked up her coffee cup. She didn't rush. She took a sip. Then she looked directly at him. "I've known you since you were 7 years old," she said. "I watched you grow. I watched your mother sacrifice years of her life so you could stand where you're standing." Daniel swallowed. "This morning," she continued, "I walked into a house where an elderly woman sits with visible injuries on her face. Injuries inflicted by her own son. That's not," he started. Margaret raised one finger. Silence snapped into place like a trap. "This is not a debate," she said. "This is an accounting." She gestured gently toward me. "Eleanor, would you like to speak?" I felt every eye turn toward me. For a brief second I wanted to disappear. Then I remembered the floor, the cabinet, the slap. "I didn't scream," I said quietly. "I didn't call anyone last night. I didn't fight back." Daniel scoffed. "Because you know how you provoke me." Detective Reed shifted his weight. Daniel stopped. "I stayed silent," I continued, "because I needed to be sure of something." Margaret leaned back slightly. "And what was that? Whether the man who hurt me was still my son." Daniel's mouth opened. Nothing came out. I looked at him, really looked, and felt the last illusion crumble. "You didn't ask if I was hurt," I said. "You didn't apologize. You came down this morning expecting obedience." His jaw clenched. "You always exaggerate." That was the lie he chose. Detective Reed spoke then, voice steady and heavy with consequence. "Domestic assault doesn't require exaggeration, Daniel. It requires evidence." He nodded toward my face, toward my lip, toward the bruise. Daniel's shoulders slumped just slightly, the first visible crack. Margaret stood. When she did, the room shifted. "You will listen now," she said. "Because what happens next will define the rest of your life." Daniel looked at me then. Really looked. And for the first time since he was a child, his voice shook. "Mom, please." But it was too late for please. Because the law had arrived. And mercy was no longer his to demand. And in the next moment, Detective Reed reached for his notebook. The sound of the pen clicking open felt louder than the slap had. Detective Reed didn't rush. He didn't glare. He didn't threaten. He simply opened his notebook and waited, and somehow that patience was more frightening than anger ever could be. Daniel stared at the pen like it was a weapon. "This is ridiculous," he said, but the confidence was gone now. His voice wavered, cracked around the edges. "You're really going to do this? Over one night?" "One night," Margaret repeated quietly. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. "One night," she continued, "doesn't bruise a woman's face and fracture her sense of safety. One night doesn't come out of nowhere. One night is the end of a pattern." Daniel shifted in his chair. His knee bounced under the table, a tell I'd known since he was 10 years old. Detective Reed looked at me. "Mrs. Whitfield," he said, respectful, steady, "I need you to tell me what happened. From the moment he arrived home." The room shrank. Every memory pressed forward at once. The key scraping, the vase shattering, the weight of his hands on my arms. Took a breath. "He came home drunk," I began. "Angry. He broke something that mattered to me and didn't care. When I asked him to go to bed, he grabbed me." Daniel shook his head. "I didn't grab you." Reed didn't look at him. "He shook me," I continued. "Threw me into the cabinet. And then he hit me." The word "hit" hung in the air. Daniel stood abruptly. "That's not how it happened." The officers shifted, subtle, controlled. "Sit down," Reed said. Daniel sat. Margaret folded her hands. "Lies unravel faster when witnesses are present," she said calmly. Reed's pen moved. Cratch, cratch, cratch. Each line he wrote felt like a door closing. "Have there been previous incidents?" Reed asked. I hesitated. Daniel leaned forward. "Don't do this." I looked at him, really looked. "You raised your voice at me for years," I said. "You took my money. You controlled my silence." He whispered, "You're ruining my life." I answered softly, "No, I'm saving mine." Reed nodded once and kept writing. Margaret stood and placed a gentle hand on my shoulder. Grounding, steady. "Daniel," she said, "this is the moment where accountability replaces entitlement." He dropped his face into his hands. The clock ticked. Finally Reed closed his notebook. He looked at Daniel. "Stand up." Daniel froze. "What?" "Stand up." Slowly, shakily, Daniel rose to his feet. My heart pounded, not with fear but with finality. Reed took a step forward. And that's when Daniel's voice broke completely. "Mom, please don't let them take me." I stayed seated, hands folded, back straight, because the hardest part wasn't calling for justice. It was watching it arrive. And as the officer reached for his cuffs, I realized this wasn't the end. It was the beginning of something far more painful, and far more necessary. The loudest sound wasn't the handcuffs. It was the door shutting behind him. Not slammed, not dramatic, just closed. A clean, final click that echoed through the house like a heartbeat stopping. The officers guided Daniel toward the porch. He didn't fight, didn't shout. He kept looking back at me over and over, like if he stared long enough I might change my mind. I didn't move. Margaret stood beside me, her presence solid, anchoring. Detective Reed paused at the threshold and met my eyes. "You did the right thing," he said quietly. I nodded, though my throat felt tight. Then they were gone. Sirens stayed off just as I'd asked. The patrol car rolled away slowly, like it didn't want to disturb the morning. And suddenly, the house was empty. Not just quiet. Me. I stood there staring at the space he'd occupied for so long. The chair he claimed, the doorway he blocked, the air he poisoned. Without him, the rooms felt unfamiliar. Larger. Echoing. Margaret guided me back to the dining table. "Sit," she said gently. My legs gave out the moment I did. That's when it hit me. Not relief. Not triumph. Grief. A deep, bone-heavy grief that folded me in half. I covered my face and cried. Not the restrained tears I'd learned to swallow over years, but the kind that shake your chest and leave you gasping. The kind that mourn what should have been. Margaret didn't speak. She simply stayed. When the storm passed, I wiped my face and looked at the table. The untouched biscuits. The cooling coffee. The place setting that would never be his again. I loved him, I whispered. Margaret nodded. I know. I still do. She met my eyes. Love doesn't require your destruction. That sentence settled into me like truth I'd been avoiding my whole life. Later, after she left, I walked through the house alone. The kitchen. The hallway. The stairs. Every room carried memories. Laughter, arguments, silence. I opened the cabinet where my grandmother's vase had shattered. Ran my fingers along the shelf. Something inside me loosened. I went upstairs and stood outside his door. For the first time I didn't feel fear. Felt boundaries. Closed the door. That night, I slept in my own bed without listening for footsteps. Without flinching at sounds. Without rehearsing apologies I didn't owe. But sleep brought dreams. And dreams brought questions. What happens when the person you saved yourself from is your own child? And tomorrow? The world would start asking questions I wasn't sure how to answer. By noon everyone knew. Not because I told them. Because truth has a way of moving faster than lies ever expect. The first knock came from across the street. Then another. Then my phone started ringing. Church friends, neighbors, people who hadn't spoken to me in years suddenly remembering my name. How are you holding up? Is it true? We're praying for you. I let the phone ring. I sat at the kitchen table and stared at my hands. They looked older than they had the day before. Lined, weathered, capable. I realized something unsettling then. For years, I had been protecting him from consequences. Now, consequences were protecting me. Margaret called around mid-afternoon. They're charging him, she said plainly. Temporary restraining order as well. He's not coming back to the house. Closed my eyes. Not relief. Finality. People will talk, she continued. Some will side with him. Some will blame you. Let them. After we hung up, I walked to the mirror again. The bruise had darkened. Purple bleeding into yellow. Only, honest, I didn't cover it. Instead, I went out onto the porch. Neighbors slowed as they passed. Some looked away. Others stared. One woman I barely knew stopped and said, "I'm sorry." He nodded. That night, I sat alone with the house settling around me. Creaks. Familiar sounds that no longer made me tense. And then my phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "How could you do this to me?" I didn't reply. Another message followed. "You destroyed everything." My hands trembled. Not from fear but recognition. The manipulation hadn't ended. Had simply changed shape. I powered the phone off and placed it face down. For the first time I chose silence for myself. But deep down I knew something else was coming. Because accountability doesn't end at arrest. It ends at acceptance. And he wasn't there yet. And neither was I. The guilt didn't arrive all at once. It crept in quietly, like it knew better than to knock. It showed up in the middle of the night, when the house was dark and my thoughts were loud. It showed up in memories, not of what he did to me, but of who he used to be. I dreamed of him as a child. Bare feet. Scraped knees. His small hand wrapped around my finger as we crossed the street. I woke up with tears already on my pillow, my chest aching like something had been pulled out and left hollow. During the day I functioned. Made tea. Watered the plants. Answered only the calls that felt safe. But every quiet moment carried the same question. Did I do the right thing? The world had an answer ready. People told me I was brave, strong, inspirational. They said things like, "I don't know how you did it," and "I could never turn in my own child." That last one cut the deepest. Because I hadn't turned him in. I had turned toward myself. Still, doubt is persuasive when it wears the face of love. One afternoon, I sat on the edge of my bed holding an old photo album. The real kind, heavy with plastic sleeves and fingerprints. I hadn't opened it in years. There he was at 5, missing his front teeth, smiling like life had never disappointed him. There he was at 12, awkward and tall, pretending not to need me anymore. There he was at 21, graduation cap tilted wrong, eyes shining with pride. I pressed my hand against the page. I tried, I whispered. Not to him. To myself. Later that evening Margaret came by. She didn't bring advice. She brought soup. We sat in silence until I finally asked the question that had been circling me for days. What if this breaks him? Margaret didn't answer immediately. Then she said, what if it already did, and you're the only one who refused to let it break you too? That settled something in me. I realized then that love without boundaries isn't love. It's surrender. And surrender doesn't save anyone. That night another message came through. This time from his attorney. He wanted to talk. Wanted forgiveness. Wanted understanding. I stared at the screen for a long time. Forgiveness. Understanding. Words that come after accountability, not before. I set the phone down. Because some conversations can only happen when both people are standing on truth. And he was still lying to himself. But I knew something else now. This wasn't just about surviving what he did. It was about deciding who I would become after. And tomorrow, I would be asked to speak again. This time, in a place where silence carries consequences. The courtroom smelled like old wood and quiet judgment. That was the first thing I noticed. Not the judge. Not my son sitting at the defense table. Not the murmurs behind me. The smell. It reminded me of churches and funerals, places where people gather to witness something final. I sat on the hard bench, hands folded, back straight, feeling every year of my age in my bones. The bruise on my face had faded just enough to look yellowed now, like a warning sign instead of a wound. I didn't cover it. Across the room, Daniel avoided my eyes. He looked smaller there. Not weak, just reduced. Stripped of the authority he'd worn at home like armor. His suit didn't fit right. His hands shook when he adjusted his tie. For the first time I saw him as the world now did. A man being held accountable. When they called my name, my heart stuttered. Not from fear but from memory. 1,000 moments rushed forward. Rocking him to sleep, cheering at his graduation, standing in that kitchen bleeding. I stood. The room fell silent. I raised my right hand and swore to tell the truth. And then I spoke. Not dramatically. Not angrily. Honestly. I told them about the fear. The manipulation. The night everything broke. I told them about silence. How it can look like loyalty, how it can feel like survival, how it almost killed me. Daniel stared at the table. The judge listened. And something inside me lifted with every word. Because speaking didn't weaken me. It anchored me. When I finished, the room felt lighter. Like a storm had passed. The judge dismissed us for the day. As I walked out, Daniel finally looked at me. Not with anger. Not with entitlement. With something raw. Regret. Fear. Loss. I didn't stop walking. Outside the air felt different. Cleaner. Sharper. Real. But I knew better than to think this was over. Justice moves slowly. Healing even slower. And the hardest part still waited ahead. Because the question wasn't whether he would face consequences. It was whether he would ever face himself. And the answer to that would come when I least expected it. A call came at dusk. That hour when the light doesn't disappear all at once. It lingers, unsure whether it's ready to let go. My phone buzzed on the table, vibrating against the wood like it was nervous. I knew who it was before I looked. I let it ring. Then voicemail. Then another call. Finally a message. Please. I need to talk to you. I stared at the words longer than I should have. My chest tightened. Not from longing but from caution. I'd learned the difference the hard way. I waited until the sun disappeared completely before I replied. You can speak. I'm listening. Seconds passed. Then the phone rang again. Answered. His voice sounded different. Not strong. Not sharp. Not performative. Mueller. I didn't know how bad it was, he said. Closed my eyes. That sentence almost fooled me. You knew, I replied gently. You just didn't care enough to stop. Silence. Then a breath I recognized. The one he used to take as a boy before admitting he'd broken something. I'm in counseling, he said quickly. The court ordered it. I'm trying. I swear I am. I hope you are, I said. Not for us. For him. I'm sorry, he whispered. The word hung there. Sorry. A word that once would have unraveled me. A word I waited years to hear. And yet, it didn't fix anything. I forgive you, I said slowly, carefully. But forgiveness doesn't mean access. Doesn't mean control. And it doesn't mean forgetting. He inhaled sharply. So, what does it mean? I stood and walked to the window. The house was quiet. It means I'm choosing peace, I said. And peace requires distance. He didn't argue. That told me more than any apology ever could. Before we hung up, he asked one last question. Will you ever trust me again? I didn't answer right away. Trust isn't rebuilt with words. It's rebuilt with time. With consistency. With humility. I don't know, I said honestly. That's up to who you become next. The call ended. I set the phone down and realized my hands weren't shaking. That's how I knew something had changed. I didn't need his apology to survive anymore. I had already forgiven myself. But forgiveness isn't the end of a story. Sometimes, it's the quiet beginning of something harder. Because the final lesson wasn't his to learn alone. The house sounds different now. Not quieter, just honest. Floorboards still creak. Clock still ticks. Wind still moves through the trees outside like it always has. But the silence no longer feels like something waiting to hurt me. Feels earned. I wake up slower these days. Not because I'm afraid of the morning, but because I don't have to brace myself anymore. No listening for footsteps. No rehearsing explanations. No calculating moods. Just breath. I sit at the same table where everything ended, and began again. The lace tablecloth is folded neatly in the drawer now. The china rests untouched. Not because I'm afraid of memories, but because I don't need symbols to prove anything anymore. Strength doesn't require ceremony. It requires truth. People still ask me how I did it. How I found the courage. I tell them the same thing every time. I didn't wake up brave. I woke up exhausted. Exhausted from shrinking. Exhausted from explaining. Exhausted from loving someone at the cost of myself. Courage didn't arrive like lightning. It arrived like a boundary. Quiet. Firm. Unmovable. I visit the garden in the evenings now. The camellia bush is blooming again. Stubborn, bright, alive. I trim it carefully, hands steady. I think about how many times I confused endurance with love. How many women do. We're taught to hold families together at any cost. To absorb harm quietly. To call survival strength, and silence peace. But peace that demands your pain is not peace. It's a prison. I still love my son. That truth hasn't changed, and it doesn't make me weak. Love doesn't disappear because boundaries appear. Love simply learns where it is no longer allowed to destroy. He is walking his own path now. Am I? And mine is lighter. Here's what I know, what I wish someone had told me sooner. You are not betraying anyone by protecting yourself. You are not cruel for refusing abuse. You are not weak for choosing distance over damage. And silence. Silence is only powerful when you choose it. I didn't lose my voice that night. Found it. And if you're listening to this wondering whether it's too late, whether you've endured too much, forgiven too long, stayed too quiet, let me say this clearly. It is never too late to choose yourself. Not at 69. Not after decades. Not even after loving someone who forgot how to love you back. You don't need permission. You don't need approval. You only need the moment when you decide that your life matters too. 'Cause it does. Thanks for listening. Don't forget to subscribe, and if you've lived through something similar, share your story in the comments. Your voice matters.